What does it take to commit the perfect crime? You'd think it's impossible in the modern world. We have DNA analysis, fingerprint databases, security cameras on every corner, cell phone tracking, forensic science that can find evidence invisible to the human eye. But what if I told you that some killers have beaten all of it? What if I told you there are murders so clean, so calculated, that even with witnesses, evidence, and sometimes even confessions, the police still couldn't make an arrest? January 15, 1947. Los Angeles. A body is found cut perfectly in half, drained of blood, and positioned in a vacant lot. No evidence. No witnesses. No leads. 1968 San Francisco. A killer calls the police himself, describes his crimes, sends letters with his handwriting, and leaves fingerprints at the scene. Still never caught. 2002 New York City. A famous DJ is murdered in a room full of people. 6 witnesses. Nobody saw anything. These aren't fictional crimes. These are real cases. And today we're going to show you exactly how these killers got away with murder. We rely on the idea that forensic science and police work will always catch the criminal. We believe that every contact leaves a trace. We trust that DNA, fingerprints, and witness testimony will eventually lead to justice. But history is filled with moments where the system failed. Where the killer didn't just escape, but actively taunted the people hunting him. Today we are looking at 4 cases where the perpetrators outsmarted the authorities. From the streets of 1940s Los Angeles to a recording studio in Queens, from the fog-covered highways of Northern California to the tidal marshes of Atlantic City. These are the crimes that broke the investigators. These are the cases that remain unsolved, not for lack of effort, but because the killers were always one step ahead. Let's begin. It started with Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old, aspiring to be famous, drifting through the post-war haze of Los Angeles. She had dark hair, pale skin, and big dreams. Friends called her Beth. The newspapers would later give her a name that would echo through history, the Black Dahlia. On that January morning in 1947, her body was found in Leimert Park, a grassy vacant lot in a residential neighborhood. But this wasn't just a murder. The scene was impossible. The killer had drained the body of blood before dumping it. There was no blood on the grass. No blood in the soil. The body had been washed clean with what investigators believed was gasoline. It was a surgical dismemberment performed with terrifying precision. The cuts were so clean that police initially believed the killer must have had medical training, possibly a doctor or a butcher. But here's what made it even more disturbing. The body had been posed. It was laid out carefully, almost deliberately, as if the killer wanted it to be found. The arms were raised above the head. The legs were spread. It was a display. A message. But to whom? And why? The LAPD launched one of the largest manhunts in history. They pulled in hundreds of suspects. They interviewed thousands of people. Detectives worked around the clock. They followed every lead, no matter how small. They checked hospitals for anyone with surgical skills. They tracked down every person Elizabeth Short had been seen with in the weeks leading up to her death. But the killer had anticipated the investigation. He didn't just leave a clean scene, he actively manipulated it. He toyed with the press in a way that would become a signature of intelligent killers in the decades to come. 9 days after the discovery, a package arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner. The newspaper staff opened it cautiously. It smelled like gasoline. The killer had used the gas to remove his fingerprints from every item inside. Inside the package were Elizabeth Short's personal belongings. Her birth certificate, business cards with her name on them, photographs of her smiling, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. The police thought they had a breakthrough. Mark Hansen was a nightclub owner who had known Elizabeth. But even this was a dead end. The killer had carefully ripped out pages from the address book before mailing it. He was giving the police just enough to keep them running in circles, but not enough to catch him. It was psychological warfare. The media frenzy that followed destroyed what was left of the investigation. Reporters trampled crime scenes looking for evidence they could publish. They withheld information from the police to get exclusive scoops. They answered the phones at the victim's mother's house before the police could notify her, pretending to be officers to get her reaction for their stories. The circus made it nearly impossible for real detective work to continue. Over the years, more than 500 people confessed to the crime. It became a psychological phenomenon. People wanted to be connected to the most famous murder in Los Angeles, but the police couldn't pin it on any of them. The physical evidence was non-existent. The timeline was a blur. Every confession fell apart under scrutiny. Theories emerged over the decades. Some believed it was George Hodel, a wealthy doctor whose own son would later accuse him of the crime. Others pointed to Leslie Dillon, a bellhop who knew too much about the case. Some even suggested organized crime or a scorned lover. But nothing ever stuck. To this day, the Black Dahlia remains the most famous unsolved murder in California history. The file is still open. But the trail went cold in 1947, and it's never been warm since. 2 decades later, just a few hundred miles north in the San Francisco Bay Area, another predator emerged. But this one didn't want to hide his work. He wanted the world to know exactly who he was. Or at least he wanted them to think they knew. On December 20, 1968, a young couple, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were shot to death in a gravel turnout on Lake Herman Road near Vallejo. They were teenagers on their first date. The police had nothing. No witnesses. No motive. No suspects. Just 2 bodies in the dark and a growing sense that something terrible had begun. 7 months later, it happened again. Another couple, Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau, were attacked in a golf course parking lot in Vallejo. The killer approached with a flashlight, blinding them before opening fire at point-blank range. Darlene died. Mike survived, but he couldn't identify the shooter clearly. The attacker had been calm, methodical. He walked up, fired multiple shots, walked back to his car, then returned to fire more rounds into their bodies before driving away. But this time the killer did something different. Something that would define this case for the next 50 years. Less than an hour after the attack, the Vallejo Police Department received a call. The voice was calm, monotone, almost robotic. He said, "I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to a public park, you will find the kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." The police were no longer dealing with a random killer. They were dealing with a narcissist, someone who wanted credit, someone who needed the world to know. 3 days later, letters arrived at 3 Bay Area newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter was nearly identical. Each contained 1/3 of a cryptic cipher, a code made up of strange symbols. The killer demanded that the ciphers be published on the front page of each paper. If they weren't, he threatened to go on a killing spree. The newspapers published them, and the world tried to crack the code. The first cipher was solved within a week by a schoolteacher and her husband. The message was chilling: "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." But he didn't stop there. On September 27, 1969, he attacked again at Lake Berryessa. This time he wore a costume. A black executioner's hood with a white circle and cross symbol stitched on the chest. He approached a couple having a picnic, tied them up, and stabbed them repeatedly. The woman died. The man survived. Before leaving, the Zodiac wrote on the victim's car door in black marker. He listed the dates of his previous attacks and drew his symbol. He was branding his work. 2 weeks later, he killed a cab driver in San Francisco. Paul Stein was shot in the head at point-blank range. The Zodiac tore off a piece of Stein's blood-stained shirt and mailed it to the Chronicle as proof. He included a taunting letter mocking the police for not catching him, even though witnesses had seen him. Even though he had left a palm print in blood on the cab. The investigation became one of the most intensive manhunts in American history. The FBI, the CIA, and even naval intelligence tried to crack his codes. They had his description. Multiple witnesses had seen him. They had his handwriting. They had ballistics. They had fingerprints. They had DNA from the stamps he licked to mail his letters. And yet he walked away. The police focused heavily on a man named Arthur Lee Allen. He matched the description. He wore a Zodiac brand watch. He had been in the areas where the murders occurred. Witnesses placed him near the scenes. But every time they got close, the evidence didn't quite fit. The handwriting was similar, but not identical. The DNA didn't match. The fingerprints didn't match. The Zodiac claimed to have killed 37 people. The police confirmed 5, maybe 7. He sent dozens of letters over the years, each one more cryptic and bizarre than the last. Some contained ciphers that have never been solved, even with modern computer analysis. Then in 1974 the letters stopped. He simply vanished. He outlasted the detectives who hunted him. He outlasted the victims who survived him. He proved that even with the killer speaking directly to the police, leaving evidence behind and practically begging to be caught, the system could still fail. To this day, amateur sleuths and professional investigators continue to analyze the case. In 2020, One of his ciphers was finally cracked by a team of code breakers. But it didn't reveal his name. It was just another taunt. The Zodiac killer remains one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. And whoever he was, he got away with it. Fast forward to October 30th, 2002. The setting shifts from desolate highways and vacant lots to the heart of New York City, a recording studio in Jamaica, Queens. This is where Jason Mizell, known to the world as Jam Master Jay of Run DMC, spent his days. Run DMC was more than just a hip-hop group. They were pioneers. They brought rap music to the mainstream. They were the first hip-hop act to go platinum, the first to appear on MTV, the first to grace the cover of Rolling Stone. Jam Master Jay wasn't just a DJ. He was a legend. On that October evening, Mizell was in his studio on the second floor of a building on Merrick Boulevard. It was a typical night. He was sitting on a couch playing video games with friends. There were people in the room, people in the hallway. The studio was busy. This wasn't a dark alley or an isolated location. This was a public space with witnesses. Around 7:30 in the evening, two men were buzzed into the building. Someone inside the studio let them in. They walked up the stairs to the second floor. One man stayed near the door, blocking anyone from leaving. The other walked directly up to Mizell. What happened next was captured in the memories of everyone in that room, but those memories would remain locked away for nearly 2 decades. The man approached Mizell. Some witnesses said they embraced as if they knew each other. Then, without warning, the man pulled out a .40 caliber handgun and fired once at point-blank range. The bullet struck Mizell in the head. He died almost instantly. The two men walked out. They disappeared into the New York night. No chase, no sirens, just silence. When the NYPD arrived, they hit a wall of silence that would stand for 18 years. There were up to 6 people in the studio at the time of the murder. 6 potential witnesses. But nobody saw anything. Nobody knew who the shooters were. Nobody heard anything useful. It was as if the murder had happened in an empty room. The security cameras that should have captured everything? They were either broken or the tapes were mysteriously missing. The buzz-in system should have recorded who entered. No useful information. The police knew this wasn't random. Jam Master Jay was killed by someone who knew him. Someone who was let into the building. Someone who walked right up to him without raising suspicion. This was personal. Detectives began digging into Mizell's life. They discovered that despite his fame, he had financial troubles. He owed money. He had been involved years earlier in the drug trade, though he had left that life behind. They looked at old beefs, old debts, old disputes from his past. They had theories. They had suspects. They knew who had a motive. But without witnesses willing to testify, they had nothing that would hold up in court. This became a perfect example of how a crime can remain unsolved not because of forensic genius, but because of fear. The perpetrators didn't need to outsmart the police with science. They relied on something much simpler, the code of silence. The culture of not cooperating with law enforcement, the fear of retaliation. For 18 years the case went cold. The killers lived their lives. They stayed in the community. Some even attended tributes and memorials for the man they had murdered. They walked past murals with his face painted on the walls. And they said nothing. It wasn't until 2020, nearly 2 decades after the murder, that federal prosecutors finally brought charges against Ronald Washington and Carl Jordan Jr. The breakthrough came when witnesses finally decided to talk. Whether it was guilt, safety, or simply the passage of time, the wall of silence finally cracked. In 2023, Carl Jordan Jr. was convicted of the murder. Ronald Washington's trial followed. Justice arrived, but it took 18 years. For nearly 2 decades, the system was paralyzed. The killers had successfully exploited the code of silence to outsmart one of the most sophisticated police forces in the world. But the question remains, how many other cases are still waiting for someone to speak? 4 years after Jam Master Jay's murder, a darker pattern emerged on the other side of the country. Atlantic City, November 2006. A city known for its casinos, its boardwalk, and its nightlife. But behind the glittering lights was a much darker world. On a cold November morning, 2 women were walking near the Golden Key Motel, a rundown establishment on the Black Horse Pike. They were cutting through a marshy area, a drainage ditch that ran behind the property. That's when they saw something in the water. It was the body of Kim Raffo, a 40-year-old woman who had been missing for weeks. But she wasn't alone. Just a few yards away, police found another body. Then a third. Then a fourth. 4 women, all found within hours of each other, all lying face down in the murky water of the drainage ditch. Their names were Kim Raffo, Molly Dilts, Barbara Brader, and Tracy Ann Roberts. They were all in their 30s and 40s. They all struggled with addiction. They all worked as sex workers in Atlantic City, and they had all been murdered by the same person. The positioning of the bodies was deliberate. They were arranged in a line, spaced out evenly. They were all facing east toward the casinos and the ocean. They were all barefoot. Their shoes were never found. The police immediately knew they were dealing with a serial killer. But what kind of killer leaves 4 bodies in the same location at the same time? The answer was someone confident. Someone who knew the police would find them. Someone who didn't care. The killer had chosen his dumping ground with surgical precision. The drainage ditch was tidal, meaning water flowed in and out with the ocean's rhythm. Every high tide washed the scene clean. DNA evidence was diluted or destroyed. Footprints were impossible to cast in the mud. And it had rained heavily in the days before the bodies were discovered, scrubbing away any trace evidence. The police couldn't even determine the exact cause of death for all the victims because of the decomposition and water damage. They knew the women had been strangled or asphyxiated based on what little evidence remained, but the physical proof was gone. This is where the Eastbound Strangler truly outsmarted the investigation. There was no primary crime scene. The women weren't killed in the ditch. They were killed somewhere else, somewhere private, and then transported to the marsh after death. But where? Atlantic City is a small city packed with motels, hotels, casinos, and private residences. The police checked motel records. They interviewed hotel staff. They canvassed the entire area. They spoke to other sex workers who might have seen something. They looked into the victims' last known movements. But they found nothing. The killer had operated in a narrow window of time. All 4 women were killed within a span of a few weeks in the fall of 2006. And then, just like the Zodiac killer decades before, he stopped. Or at least he stopped in Atlantic City. There were suspects. Handymen who worked at the Golden Key Motel. Local Johns who had been violent with other women. Drug dealers who had known the victims. But nothing stuck. Every lead evaporated. Every suspect had an alibi or insufficient evidence linking them to the crimes. The killer had utilized the environment itself as his accomplice. He used the water to destroy DNA. He used the mud to erase footprints. He used the transient nature of Atlantic City, a city where thousands of people come and go every day, to blend into the crowd. He knew that sex workers in that area were vulnerable. He knew their disappearances might not be immediately reported. He knew the police would have a hard time finding witnesses in a community that didn't trust law enforcement. The investigation continues to this day, but it has been nearly 20 years since those 4 women were found. The case files remain open. Detectives still receive tips. DNA technology has improved dramatically since 2006. And investigators have re-examined evidence with modern tools. But so far, nothing has led to an arrest. 4 crosses still stand near the drainage ditch behind the Golden Key Motel. A grim reminder of the lives lost and the killer who was never caught. These 4 cases span nearly 60 years of American criminal history. They cross the country from coast to coast. They involve different methods, different motives, and different types of killers. But they all share one disturbing truth: the perpetrators got away with it. The Black Dahlia killer used forensic precision and media manipulation. The Zodiac killer used psychological warfare and cryptic games. Jam Master Jay's murderers exploited the code of silence for 18 years. And the Eastbound Strangler used the environment itself to erase the evidence. These cases remind us that the truth isn't always inevitable. Justice isn't always served. Sometimes the clues don't add up. Sometimes the witnesses don't speak. Sometimes the evidence is washed away by the tide. And sometimes the person responsible is smart enough, lucky enough, or ruthless enough to walk away. The files remain open. The families still wait. Cold case detectives continue to review the evidence, hoping that new technology or a deathbed confession will finally bring closure. But for now, these remain the crimes that broke the system. The perfect murders. The ones that got away. If you want to see more deep dives into cases that baffled investigators, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments which of these cases you think is closest to being solved.